Coming into this beautiful moment, we take another deep breath. And for those of you who are just joining us right now, we just finished listening to The House That Built Me by Miranda Lambert, a beautiful song that captures the impermanence of life, which today's sermon is going to be touching on notes from Release the Mundane, tenet 6 or tenet 7 from Living Peace. And so let's take another deep breath. And something I've been sharing lately with one-on-one sessions and sometimes in the group classes is it's really important to remember that right here in this moment that we're all interacting with each other, only this moment will ever exist in all of eternity. Sure, we could get into parallel universes and all that stuff, but if we really think about it, in every single second, minute, day that passes us by, it is a unique vibrational stamp in the universe. And it's so fascinating how we often take every second, every minute, every moment by granted most of the time. And we know that we're taking it for granted when we're not present with it, when we're thinking of the next thing we're going to be doing, or we're thinking about the past. And just, it's very humbling to recognize how much beauty passes us by. And all of us have experienced pain and probably deep suffering in our lives. But what's fascinating is that those moments of pain and suffering are often not necessarily long-lasting, but what keeps them long-lasting is our constant memory, our constant imagination, our memory and resistance of what things have happened in the past, our anticipation and stress and concern for things that are coming. And we can walk outside, and depending on where we're at, it might be a very beautiful day, but we completely miss the awareness that it's a beautiful day. Every single night, I take Snow Angel out for her last potty of the evening. And you see the stars above, and here we can see them very clearly and see the Milky Way. And lately, my own practice has been walking outside and taking a solid moment to very look up and recognize, the expansiveness of this universe, and how fascinating it is that when I'm caught in my own internal mental or emotional suffering, or even physical pain at times, that we completely miss those moments. They just completely skip us by. And so I really just want to take a moment to remind us that most of our days are actually okay. Can we hear that? Most of our days are actually okay. But depending on the mental overlay, a teaching from Living Peace that I share, we have a mental bias and a mental filter that we see life through, the neutrality of life that we then create this mental overlay on top of that then colors the world around us, that turns that neutralness either into something potentially more beautiful or that neutralness into something much more grotesque, something that is very hard to swallow, something that is very hard to absorb. So let's take a breath. So for those of you who have this, go ahead and open up your little pamphlets. And I think because today's sermon's going to really focus a lot on this, I'm going to go ahead and post the quote in the description down below in the YouTube area. So for those of you who are listening at home or wherever, you're welcome to still read along. So I'm going to be taking this verse by verse. And this is by Shantideva. Unruly beings are as unlimited as space. They cannot possibly all be overcome. But if I overcome thoughts of anger alone, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all foes. And I'm going to break that down, but let's read it line by line. Unruly beings are as unlimited as space. And what this means is individuals, people, things that are just unobservantly spilling energy and bumping into each other. And so unruly beings, it's not this aggressive concept. It's a concept that many of us, as we go through life, we are unbeknownst to us. We're constantly spilling our vibes onto everyone, and we're constantly bumping into each other, causing friction. And a lot of it comes from our own internal pain and unresolved emotional karma, so to speak. And so when we're bumping into people and causing pain in each other, maybe we're the abuser in one situation, or we're the abused in another situation, or just grief is happening, impatience is happening. It could be any type of, quote, negative emotion. none of it is actually bad. None of it is actually wrong. It's literally just when we're so caught up in our own mental overlay, we cannot always see the harm that we are causing by our thoughts, by our emotions, by our actions. And sometimes it can even just be having a rough day, and then we're going out and checking out something, and we speak in a tone to the person who's checking us out at the store. I'm sure all of us have done that to one extent. Like, it was a long line, we were waiting for a while, and we may have noticed that there was a tone of impatience in our voice interacting with someone. And that right there is a form of violence and separation. And we're so oblivious to it because we're so caught in our own pain. And again, I don't want to say that this is not bad or wrong, but it's just something that when we are not in full awareness, we are creating these ripple effects of frustration on the planet. And they do influence other people, just as other people's vibrations are influencing us. And so unruly beings are as unlimited as space. Makes sense. Just because most of humanity is still in that degree of unawareness. They cannot possibly all be overcome, of course. But if I overcome thoughts of anger alone, and when I like to kind of shift this to thoughts of conflict and thoughts of separation. So really any type of thought that you have that is in contrast to another being, including yourself, that is the thoughts of anger. So, but if I overcome thoughts of separation, thoughts of conflict, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all foes. And again, vanquishing all foes sounds very strong. So I like to shift it to vanquishing the source of my affliction, vanquishing the source of my pain. Affliction is just anything that is causing pain, causing suffering. And so equivalent to vanquishing the source of affliction. Now let's go ahead and read it all together with my slight interpretations. Unruly beings are as unlimited as space. They cannot possibly all be overcome. But if I overcome thoughts of separation and thoughts of conflict, this will be equivalent to vanquishing the source of my affliction. Interesting. And so it brings us back. It brings us back to my thoughts about life. And if you really think about it, if you're having a great day, or if you're having a rough day, sometimes you just have those days and there's nothing external that's promoting it, right? Some days you wake up just on that certain side of the bed. And when you're on that certain side of the bed, you may notice that the things that normally cause you impatience don't really impact you in the same way. But what's fascinating is that sometimes you might wake up on the other side of the bed, and things that normally don't bother you all of a sudden are bothering you. So what is the common denominator? The common denominator is your mind. It is the relationship that you're having with your own mind, body, spirit, or mind, body, heart connection in that moment, and the energy that you're bringing out into the world. And so that is the essence of what we seek to accomplish here. Andrew and I do our best to live it, and then we're doing our best to teach it to the community. And already in these short 6 months that we've been together, we've seen an amazing impact in the lives that we've been interacting with, and that's really juicy and delicious and wonderful. But this is still one of the ongoing issues that not only we struggle with, but all of us struggle with this in our room. And even the community in Arizona that we've been working with for the past decade has been struggling with, is that when we lose our in-touchness with our mind-body connection, our words are going to get funky towards life, our actions are going to get a bit funky. And this might develop, going back to our addictive tendencies. Last night I ate a whole damn bag of donuts. There it is. There it is. And I was mindfully eating them. I'm just like, this one's gonna make me a little bit sicker. Okay, but it tastes so good going down. And so then it has to go towards, what is the mental thing that I'm covering up that is leading me to want this boost of exhilaration, when if I was fully at peace, I would not be having that same inclination. And so I got to do some introspection work there, and it was quite a beautiful experience. But what's fascinating is the more peace that we develop, the more mind-body connection, which I'm going to be talking a lot about on our workshop this next Saturday. The more you balance that, you're going to notice that these tendencies of reaction towards life's hardships and triggers become less and less, and you start to develop more of an equilibrium. So let's move on to the next segment. Where would I find enough leather to cover the entire surface of the earth? but with leather soles beneath my feet, it's as if the whole world has been covered. Now, this is a story that some of you may have heard before. It's actually quite a common story in these type of circles, where there was once upon a time, there was a man who was so sick of stepping on thorns. Every time, anywhere he'd walk on the world, he'd find thorns and they'd step on, and he'd step on them, and it would cause him great agony. And he was a leather worker. So slowly but surely, again, here's it going to get a bit mythical, he starts covering the world with leather. Because, you know, if the whole world is covered with leather, then all the thorns are covered up and he doesn't have to worry about being stepping on them. And so finally one day, just like a wise man approached him and just like, maybe not even a wise man, just anyone just pointed it out. You know, you're a leather worker, so why don't you just, you know, make yourself some shoes? It'll save you so much time. You don't have to constantly cover the world. You know, that'll be your life's work. You'll just have to constantly keep every step you take. You're gonna have to put leather down, but instead just put on some damn shoes. And then, of course, the epiphany happened. And so now, without understanding, let's reread this. Where would I find enough leather to cover the entire surface of the earth? But with leather soles beneath my feet, it's as if the whole world has been covered. And so again, leather is the protection from thorns or the protection from things that trigger us. And the leather soles, and this is the real kicker here, it's about transforming the self versus trying to transform the world. I don't doubt for 1 second every single one of us in this room has had the thought of whenever you're triggered by, like, you turn on the news and you get triggered, right? And so we've all been there. And then you just think, well, if the world would just change, if people would just wake up, whichever side of the equation that you're on, you have an opinion about it, and then it triggers you, and you just said, if only this, you know, it's like you have a solution in you, and if everyone just agreed with it, everything would be fine. That's the concept. That's the perception of trying to change the world to make you feel comfortable. But in actuality, and all ancient mysticism always goes back to this nugget of wisdom. It's not about changing the world. It's about transforming yourself. It's about transmuting yourself. It's about transcending yourself, which of course we do. And the 9th tenet, which is release self, which is another word of saying transcending the attachment to self. And so when we do the inner work, and I'm sure all of you have at least experienced this, at least to some degree, the more peace you develop in your life, or maybe you've had a great year. You may have had 40 rough years, but you may have had one really awesome year. And even if you just had one awesome year, you may have noticed that the outer situations that led to your awesome year actually helped you have a nicer perception, and you were more patient, you were more kind, you were more etc. But then maybe life took a turn and rough things started happening again. And unfortunately, that's how most people live. They're very circumstantial livers. I like that. Are you a circumstantial life liver? Meaning you're doing great when external things are going great. You're doing rough when external things are going rough. But what's beautiful is that that's not the path to peace. But you can recognize that when things are going, quote, good, you have more patience. And so you know what that feels like. So now the shifting awareness is to start cultivating that on a daily basis of, once again, combining that mind-body connection using the heart as the focal point, which again, we'll talk more about on Saturday. And so I just love that. I love that transforming the self versus transforming the world. And any single one of you who have ever tried to get caught up in trying to understand the state of the world and trying to change it, again, it almost can make you go insane. You know, it splits the mind because it's so exhausting, because you can't bring it all together, because there's as many realities coexisting on this planet as there are people. Can you hear that? There are as many realities coexisting on this planet as there are people. So there are over 7 billion realities coexisting all at once. And what we're trying to do is we're seeing life through our reality lens, but then we can't even fathom all 7 billion and rectifying them in our mind. It doesn't work that way. We are the single drop, and then the ocean is a multitude of drops, just as we are a single reality amongst a multitude of realities that then creates the world as we know it, just as each droplet collectively creates the ocean as we know it. Pretty cool analogy. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't influence the world, you know, because when we go back to our peace, or when we're in frustration, we're sending out ripples. I mean, we're constantly being influenced by other people in the world. So we know that there's an influencing force. But at the end of the day, it's really important to recognize that if our goal is to be constantly influencing, then we're not doing the inner work. But what's fascinating is if we change that focus to do the inner work, then naturally our peace just starts to radiate out like ripples upon the ocean. Let's take a breath. Likewise, it's not possible for me to restrain the external course of things. But should I restrain this mind of mine, what else would be the need to restrain? What would be the need to restrain all else? Let me repeat that. Likewise, it is not possible for me to restrain the external course of things. But should I restrain this mind of mine, what would be the need to restrain all else? So restrained mind would simply be the prevention from it becoming the source of affliction. Because really think about it, shitty things have happened to all of us, right? And they're very painful, very painful. But that was the moment. But then it is our mind and its perception of that thing that occurred that keeps invoking it every single day, that keeps it alive and keeps the suffering present within us. So there's the pain, the tangible pain, but then it eventually becomes a memory pain, or it becomes an imagination pain, because some of us even create stories that don't exist and they make us suffer. Ever think about the future and anticipation stresses? That's imagination, people. Because it's always different by the time you get to it. The circumstance is always different than what you imagine, because it's so hard to pinpoint the perfected, concise, precise situation that's going to occur, because there's so many external factors. But nonetheless, we like to anticipate it, thinking that we're preparing ourselves. But what's fascinating is that as long as we're anticipating it, generally we're not at peace. And so if you spend a whole week preparing for like a very important thing that you're going to be doing, and that whole week is not at peace, and then you get to it, you really think you're going to be the embodiment of peace in that? Because when you're peaceful, you're more rational. You can actually respond to stressful stimuli much more effectively. But if you are at peace that whole week, and then you go into the difficult conversation or interview or whatever the heck it's going to be, you're going to be so much more ready for it than all of that mental illusory prep work that you were creating in that previous week. That's very important to understand. So again, the restrained mind is preventing it from becoming our source of affliction. And then restraining all else becomes a non-issue, because when inner peace is present, you are not so much concerned with the happenings of the world, because you have a trust within yourself to show up. And you're able to show up with a rational mind. You're able to show up with a mind-body-heart connection. You're able to show up and respond rather than react. A lot of times when we're a very reactory individual, we're very concerned with circumstances because we don't know how we're going to handle it. But the more inner peace that we develop, we're not so much concerned with negative things happening anymore, because we know that no matter how painful it gets, we're going to still show up and do the work. Ooh, let me repeat that. No matter how painful it gets, we're going to still show up and do the work. Now that's power. That is the personal power that we're looking to cultivate. So I'll go ahead and read this whole little section one more time, then we're going to move on. Unruly beings are as unlimited as space. They cannot possibly all be overcome. But if I overcome thoughts of anger alone, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all foes. Where would I find enough leather to cover the entire surface of the earth? But with leather soles beneath my feet, it's as if the whole world has been covered. Likewise, it is not possible for me to restrain the external course of things. But should I restrain this mind of mine, what would be the need to restrain all else? Shantideva, deep breath. One more quote by him that I'd like to go ahead and share, but let's take another breath of pause. And in this beautiful moment of pause, I'm coming back to the present moment, and I'm just looking out the window, and it's having a sun shower, which is one of my favorite things, where it's raining, but it's sunny.
Monkey's money.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
And so that always brings me a lot of joy, recognizing that. And it happens so often here in Colorado. Didn't happen too much in Arizona. So let's take another deep breath. We who are like senseless children shrink from suffering, but love its causes. We hurt ourselves. Our pain is self-inflicted. Why should others be the object of our anger? You know, so going back to my little donut whole bag eating scenario, you know, old me would have just been like, what the fuck, Andrew? Why would you bring that garbage into our home? I know a lot of spouses that point fingers at their beloved ones, or even just any form of relationship or roommate or family dynamic. There's someone in the household that brings something home that then we get into. And then we point the finger. But in actuality, it was still our choice. It was still our choice. It's always our choice. And so it's important to recognize that we absolutely do shrink from suffering, but we love its causes. Really think about that. All these things that cause us pain, we are self-choosing to activate with our mind, or we're activating with our actions. Activating with the mind, thinking about it in a certain way, or activating with our actions, indulging in it in whatever way. And so I absolutely find that so fascinating. And I know for me personally, I cannot speak for any of you, but if I look back on like all of the deep sufferings that I've had throughout my life, a lot of it, if not all of it, was a self-chosen perception and a self-chosen action on how I was handling grief, handling anger, expressing grief, expressing anger, because shitty things happen. We can't avoid that. I wouldn't even call them shitty. I just saw them very painful things happen. But then how we handle those painful things often make our pain 10 times or 100 times worse. And then we spiral downhill. And then once we're rolling downhill, we roll over people, don't we? You know, other people become like knocked out by our behavior. And then we constantly point back to the suffering that we previously had as justification for our then negative ripples and reactions to the people around us. And it just becomes this self-serving, self-reinforcing pain body experience that we really can't escape. But then we go back to release the attachment to the mundane world. And here's the really difficult pill to swallow. Absolutely everything is impermanent. Absolutely everything is impermanent. And it is our attachment to wanting the things that we like, the things that we love, the things that we enjoy to be permanent that causes our pain, rather than accepting the natural flow and the natural transitory nature of this existence. And so I know for me personally, you know, obviously this concept of, you know, the death and the birth recycling is one of the most difficult things, because the loss of loved ones, I would say, is probably the ultimate painful experience, or the anticipation of the loss. And so that has always been an ongoing thing where this is going to sound so awful, and I apologize ahead of time, but in some monk training experiences, they actually have the novices go towards, this was back in the day, go to the places where bodies were just kind of thrown into the ravine, and they would watch the decomposing flesh and the decomposing and the smell. They would just be completely surrounded by the essence of the death experience. And they would look at the transitory nature of this physical body. And on one hand, it was very useful because it helped them get over their attachment to flesh. And so anytime they would have lustful thoughts, they would always go back to that imagery, because again, monks have to be celibate. But on the other hand, they had to recognize that the essence of the loved one was no longer in that body. And so it actually helped them rectify that the essence, the impermanent part, or rather the permanent part of the soul, or they wouldn't even call it the soul, but the essence of our loved one exists within us now. And so it actually helped them unattach from the physical nature of the physical body, if that makes sense. I don't think I'm doing justice for this explanation, but there it is nonetheless. But really think about that for a moment. If we all had to actually do that, I think a lot of us would just completely collapse under under the essence of that, the very idea of that, because we've created a culture of protection around this idea of beauty, around this idea of wellness, around this idea of how life should look like, that we actually separate ourselves a lot from the actual things that are very uncomfortable, such as mortality. And so when we come face to face with it, it actually forces us to acknowledge all of the emotions that comes with that, and then even think of our own mortality. And then there's this point that crosses over of where acceptance occurs. And once that acceptance occurs, we're then able to return back to the present moment and actually live our lives and move forward, carrying forward with us the positive and the beautiful and even the painful memories of everything that came before us, all of our ancestors, all of our loved ones, that we are now the living embodiment of, that we are carrying forward with our mindfulness, with our actions, with our loving speech, with our peaceful responses. And so it almost becomes a beautiful mantle on our shoulders that we are then the living essence that carries it forward. And it becomes this beautiful relationship with the other side, with our loved ones, with our ancestors, etc. But what happens currently in our culture is that we collapse under the pressure, and then we lose ourselves, and it becomes a suffering pain body that then negatively impacts the people around us. Then those people are negatively impacted, and then it becomes this constant ripple effect because we're not able to fully acknowledge and fully deep down accept the impermanence of releasing our attachment to the mundane world. Does that make sense? Again, I hope I did that justice. I may not have, and I apologize if I did not, but it's one of those more difficult concepts to really come to terms with. So let's take a breath. We who are like senseless children shrink from suffering, but love its causes. We hurt ourselves. Our pain is self-inflicted. Why should others be the object of our anger? Senseless children simply means the untrained mind. It's a form of ignorance. Love its causes, an attachment to affliction bringing desires, and the objects of our anger become non-issues through self-awareness. So again, all of these teachings constantly go back to self-awareness, understanding the self, accepting impermanence, understanding how our actions and our emotions and our unresolved emotions especially are creating ripples out upon the world, and also recognizing that the ripples that we're receiving from external sources don't necessarily have to impact us in the same way. When we return to the self-awareness, when we return to being able to rectify the vanquishing of all foes, so to speak, through overcoming the thoughts of conflict and overcoming the thoughts of separation. So these two quotes really go hand in hand with each other. And I really like the part where it says the senseless children, the senseless children, the senseless children, because all of us are just big children at the end of the day. We're all still just doing the best that we can. And all of us are still going to bump into each other. We're still going to accidentally hurt each other. And none of it is bad or wrong. It's just we're still learning to grow and what we might call become enlightened beings, so to speak. And I don't necessarily prefer the word enlightened. I like to use the word self-actualize. Self-actualize is the understanding of rectifying the mind-body, heart, mind-body-spirit connections so that we are in equilibrium with ourselves. And most people on this planet never get to that part. And it makes sense because most of us are not taught these teachings at all. And even those of us who are, they're still very difficult to put into practice. And so with a deep breath, we've actually used up our time, and I was actually going to be reading a bit of a long story from this book, which really kind of brings the point home, but unfortunately we don't have time for that today. But I think I might share this in the workshop that's coming up on Saturday because it does go into that. And so I'll share a few words. You know, this Dunasha spirituality workshop that we're going to be having next Saturday is really about understanding the 5 branches of influence and the 5 vines of attachment from Dunasha. These are 10 brand new teachings that I have not taught to anyone, not even this guy. And they're from my book, Living Earth. And because it's a 6-hour workshop, which we're actually going to be enjoying a nice lunch outside and some nature connection time as well. It's going to give us a lot of time and a lot of back and forth dialogue that's going to allow us to really understand these teachings on a very deep, fundamental level, rather than you all just lovingly coming on a Sunday and me speaking to you, speaking at you. Because unfortunately, words don't teach necessarily. You know, you can incorporate them and say, yeah, that sounds kind of cool, and I want to work on that. But it's a bit harder to put it into full practice when you're just listening to a sermon. Again, I mean, I know it's beneficial, but at the end of the day, it's not like the breakthrough. And I recognize that. And so I really am excited of talking about the 5 branches of influence, and especially how to rectify our own alignment so we're not constantly being beaten up by the storms of life, and how we can actually become the player versus the pawn. Because a lot of us may feel like we're just pawns being moved around in life, and then just another thing happens, and then we're actually becoming the influencer rather than the influencee with the vibrations that we're sending out. Again, there is some really trickiness there, because you don't want to go into it with the goal of becoming the influencer, because that traps you in ego. But what's beautiful is when you rectify the mind-body-heart connection, you're going to just naturally develop a stability within your own emotional equilibrium that is a positive impact to every single person around you. And then we're going to conclude the 5 teachings with the 5 teachings of attachment. And it's really interesting to see on a fundamental thing, what are those root causes of suffering, and how in Dunasha we really seek to realign it. Because what's beautiful is that the tree of life is our logo and our symbol. And so think of the vines trying to crawl up the trunk and siphoning the life out of the tree, which can happen depending on where you're at, where the tree's located, what vines are around it. It can completely consume it. And think of yourself as that tree with the deep roots into the earth and the branches coming out, and your practice is that strong trunk. And if you don't have a strong practice, those attachments of life are going to constrict your life force, your chi energy, that then make you feel depleted on a daily basis. And so I'm really excited to bring these 10 teachings together, because they just create a delicious platform for further individual practice towards inner peace. Let's take a deep breath. And I'll end with this little nugget I wrote down. It goes more with the story I was going to share, but it still fits. If we are suffering, we can return to the basics. If we are suffering, we can return to the basics of our practice. And at the end of the day, I think last week, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about how your spiritual life is your ordinary life, and there's no separation. And so for me, the basics is being present at home, doing the dishes, taking care of the yard, being present with our animals, being present for my loved ones, and just being alive in that moment. Many Taoist and Zen teachers emphasize that it's the daily chores that lead to enlightenment, the daily activities that you're doing with your full mind, body, heart connection, your full mindfulness, that allows enlightenment to come through. Because think about it, if you're always working on some external source of relief or enlightenment, you're not doing the daily activities, or maybe you're still doing the daily activities, but you're not present with it. So if you're not present with those daily activities, which inherently make up your life, you're not alive for a single moment of your life. So it does make sense. You could be living in your mind all this time trying to work toward peace, enlightenment, actualization, relief, etc. But if you can't be alive with the very simple things and find enjoyment in the simple things that actually create the foundation of your life, then you're never going to get there, because this is what's actually tangible. This is what's actually real. So as Thich Nhat Hanh would teach you, all of y'all's homework is to go home and do the dishes. And when you're doing the dishes, only think of doing the dishes. Your mind is only in that present moment of washing those dishes. And then you can also have a meal. Cook a meal, only be present while cooking the meal. And then when you eat the meal, only be present when you're eating the meal. That is what it means to come back to the present moment. And that might be the first time in your whole life you've ever been alive, because that's the aliveness of being in the moment. So anytime you're suffering, recognize that you don't need some external thing that's going to come fix you, or these tools that you need to add to your tool belt that's going to come fix you. What's important is just to come back to the moment and take care of what's already in front of you. To sweep the sidewalk and to be alive with sweeping the sidewalk, to look up to the stars, to look up to the beautiful sky and actually see the sky and actually see the stars. That is what it means to be alive. Let's take a breath. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Juicy talk today. I hope you all got to enjoy some little nuggets of inspiration, and maybe it can help strengthen your own practice. And so for those of you at home, we appreciate those of you who've been able to offer us some donations, because again, that's how we keep this place open. And for those of you who maybe want some one-on-one interaction and coaching, is my specialty, so I'm happy to offer that. Links are down below for my book, Living Peace, options to donate, and of course our website if you ever want to do some one-on-one coaching or Zen training. We look forward to seeing you next week. Mwah.